Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Erev Tov. I want to say, first of all, how thrilled I am to be here tonight, that you have received me here among you. Students that I taught 52 years ago. About 6 months ago, I went onto the internet and I Googled Frank Iny and Shamash School, Baghdad. And I left a message on it saying I was an English teacher in 1958. Does anyone remember me? And I immediately got replies from Emil, of course, one from Jack Atrakji, one from Eli Timon, and another from his brother Charles. That was within the first day or two of leaving my message. And then out of the blue came the invitation from Emil that we were having a reunion, quite out of the blue. And I came across from France, where I was, and yesterday, to be here among you. I'm afraid I don't recognize many of you. You've changed a bit in 50 years. But I do remember names.
So are you.
And I have here, I kept a diary every day I was in Iraq. And I have 10 of these. And this is the one that I'm going to be reading from tonight. Because at my age now, my memory is not as good as it was. But with the help of my diary, I will be able to go through a few names which most of you will recognize. Unfortunately, I didn't write down surnames, so I've got lots of first names, Amirs and Suads and all the rest of it. So maybe you'll be able to recognize from what I say about them who they are. I came to Baghdad in 1957 from Turkey. I had been teaching in Turkey for 2 years in Ankara, and I want to say that within a day or two of teaching at the Frank Iny, there was a fantastic culture shock, which I will explain to you in a minute. The school I was teaching in Ankara was Ankara College, and it was a very rich private school for the rich and privileged of Ankara. Most of their fathers were in the government or in finance. A very limited number of students were allowed to go to Ankara College. And I have to say that the students themselves were not very prepossessing. They did not really have a tremendous interest in learning English. There was no literature taught, by the way. One of the subjects I loved teaching at the Frank Iny, but in Ankara they were not interested in poetry or in Shakespeare. They were interested in learning the language, but mainly so that they could understand the words of the new American pop songs and perhaps follow the dialogues and the imported American and British films. So in a way, the teaching was not terribly pleasant. It was a hard work. There was also a kind of what you might call subtle corruption going on. When we were correcting examination papers, you would often get the Bash Muavin, the head teacher, leaning over and saying, "Aha, Hikmet, his father is the Minister of Finance. We would like him to have a good mark." Of course, we didn't give in to this form of pressure, but it didn't matter, because no matter what the results in the exams were, they all passed in the end. So we were a bit disappointed in the teaching, especially as I'd come from the strict Scottish regime where I'd been teaching before. So we decided to leave. But even if we hadn't decided to leave, we were asked to leave, because I had written an article for the Times Educational Supplement about the difference between the Scottish and the Turkish educational system. It was a bit critical, which perhaps was not very kind of me because I was a guest in their country, but I was angry at what we were asked to do. So it was published, and the next day, after it was published, I was called to the British Embassy, to the ambassador, who gloried in the name of Peregrine Pemberton Pigott. And he said to me, what you've written has damaged Turkish-English, English, not British, Turkish-English relations, and the school is not going to renew your contract. So we left, went back to Scotland, and I wanted to continue teaching in the Middle East because I loved the whole area. So I saw a job advertised at the Iny and Shamash. I applied for it, I was interviewed in London and was accepted. So my wife and I, we arrived in the autumn of 1957 at the school. As I said earlier, it was quite a culture shock because when we got within 2 or 3 days of teaching at the Iny, we realized, and my wife did some teaching as well, that the students were interested in learning. They were keen to learn. They were eager to learn, not only English language, but my own subject, my first degree was in English literature. And I loved teaching English literature. And I had 2 classes, one in the 4th year and one in the 5th. And one particular class I enjoyed and looked forward to very much was a class of 7 girls. The literature class, Suad remembers it, a literature class of 7 girls. And although they were, 16, 17, they were mature, they were serious, they were not keen only in listening to me, but they were keen to argue and to discuss. And they were also very amusing. It was a class that I looked forward to when I had them, very much indeed. And I remember teaching them Dr. Faustus and The Winter's Tale. And I remember the pleasure I had in teaching Macbeth because I could read all the parts with a Scottish accent. But teaching The Winter's Tale and teaching Dr. Faustus was not easy. It wasn't easy for them, and it wasn't easy for me, because trying to teach Shakespeare to students, no matter how interested they are, who have no background in English history, no background in the English medieval setup. And it was a challenge for them, as it was for me. And I think that we both met that challenge well, and I remember it very, very clearly. Now, when the I may have painted a very rosy picture of teaching at the time. There may have been submersive mumblings and grumblings and indiscipline, but it never came to the front. We never knew if anything of that was going on. And another thing, another difference between teaching at the Iny and in Ankara was that not everyone at the Iny passed the first time. I have a note in my diary, and I hope you won't mind my mentioning their names. Did not pass 4th year final exam, did not pass Maurice, Samir. Great. If I'd been bribed, he would have passed, but he didn't bother bribing me. So, thank you, Maurice. But you've done very well since then. Samir, who was Samir? Do you know who that was?
I passed for sure.
It must have been another one. And Janet? Ah, well. Anyway, that just proved that it was a school that demanded progress and good marks. And I was glad that when you gave someone 49, they didn't put it up to 51. which had happened in the previous school I was at. Well, as I say, my teaching at the Frank Iny was mostly in the morning. As you know, the school closed at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So I did a lot of private lessons in the afternoon and in the evening. And for 1 dinar a time, I remember I was paid.
Big money.
Yeah, it was big money then. Doesn't seem much now. As I said, teaching was pleasurable, and fairly uneventful at times. But there is one thing that stands out, although there were no problems with discipline at all, one thing that stands out very vividly in my memory was one day I was teaching a 4th year class of boys, the door flew open, and Mr. Obadiah burst in, gave me a brief nod, pointed to a boy at the back of the room, stand up. He didn't speak English, of course. He told him he spoke in Arabic or Hebrew. No, stand up. And for 5 minutes, he berated the boy, eyes flashing, gesticulating, really angry. And the interesting thing was, the boy responded in exactly the same way. Eyes flashing, gesticulating, shouting back at Mr. Obadiah. And this went on for 5 minutes. And I don't know who it was. Was it you, Samir? Anyway, as soon as...
The British Embassy at the
Yeah.
time.
After a brief nod to me again, Mr. Obadiah slammed the door and walked out. And I said to the class, what was all that about? And everybody bent their eyes down to their desk, and answer came there none. So it must have been something fairly serious. But that was the only time I saw Mr. Obadiah lose his temper. He was always very gentlemanly, always very professional. And I'm sure the students respected him as much as the staff.
Those guys who were talking so nice about them,
What?
they were reading the prayer for the dead.
Ah. Well, this is, yeah. But I'm sure that I had nothing but respect for Mr. Obadiah. And he must have been, as I say, respected by the students as well as by the staff. There are other small details in my diary which I'd like to read you some of, which describe some of the events of that time. You were quite young at that time, and I was involved in other activities which you would not have been allowed to be involved in. So I can give you, I think I will read you some of the little incidents that I've written down in my diary, and this was for 1958. Not terribly exciting, this, but it's a good description of some things that happened during the day. It rained very heavily 2 nights ago, with the result that the road from our Mushtamal to the main road was sunk under about 6 inches of water and treacherous mud. The car ploughs its way through like a motorboat, bespattering the cringing, gesticulating Arabs, picking their way like storks on long brown legs. When I reached the main road, the car slithered into a ditch and landed on its side. But it was not there for long, because the same Arabs that I had soaked earlier came rushing up and good-humouredly put the car right again. And then I got here. I had a private lesson with Farid at 5 o'clock, and just as I was leaving, Abdul Karim Qasim arrived home. Farid's house is nearly opposite. His arrival was heralded by a burst of clapping and shouting. His new Chevrolet wagon came swiftly along the road with about a dozen old women and girls in pursuit. There was a jeep of armed soldiers in front and another jeep of armed soldiers behind with their guns at the ready. And they leapt to the road as soon as the car reached the house. The garage door was up, the Chevrolet went inside, the door was pulled down, presumably the Prime Minister got out, and the door again opened to let the car out. There was more applause for the empty car, from the handful of bystanders. There was only a handful because the people were asked to keep away. And the soldiers, good-humouredly, dispersed the excited, adoring crowd. And then, today is the first day of the big Muslim feast, Eid al-Fitr, to mark the end of Ramadan. There was a great deal of speculation yesterday as to whether there would be a holiday today, depending on whether the moon was sighted last night or not. However, I telephoned one of my pupils and was informed that it had been officially announced. The holiday will continue until Monday. And then, this being their biggest feast, the Arabs were dressed in their own finery. The usually dowdy, dirty women in their soiled abbas, and the men in their ill-fitting cast-off Western clothes were transformed this morning. The women still wore their black abbas, but underneath they wore red or blue or purple dresses, usually in satin or taffeta, with shoes on their feet. The men wore blue or maroon or green slacks, with new jackets, polished shoes, and ties even. The children wore vast, flouncing dresses with bows, bustles, and ribbons. One of the little scallywags, who usually holds the gate open for me with one hand and asks for a bakshish with the other, surprised me by appearing with a shirt and trousers and shoes. He usually wears a dish dash. His hands were brightly hennaed. He was gracious and self-conscious in his new clothes. I gave him 50 fills. And then, later on, as I said, my wife went home for 6 months. She was expecting a new baby, and she came after the revolution. We didn't want to have the baby born at a time when there might be difficulties. So she came back after 6 months with another little boy. But during the 6 months she was away, I took advantage of it, and I occasionally went to a nightclub. And I've got down here, tonight, I indulged in a little nightlife in Alex's, my wife is called Alexandra, in Alex's absence, a nightclub with an American friend, Richard. It was in Rashid Street, called the Babylon, I think. And I've got down here nothing but belly dancing and blatant sexuality. A group of fat Arabs waiting at the back to pick up girls at the end. They paid double for Christian girls. Presumably, if they had been Jewish, they would have paid treble for Jewish girls. And then another time I've got down here, tonight, back at the school for an Arabic play. It started half an hour late, but we had the pleasure of hearing Mendelssohn's violin concerto while we were waiting. Because we were a Jewish school, the national anthem was played in full from beginning to end, where the cinemas only play the first half. Also, there was much more silence and respect than you get from the Arabs in the cinemas. The acting was rather wooden and strange. There was, all throughout the whole play, an inexplicable gesture, like a frantic wave to the audience. I discovered later that what they were doing was brushing flies from their faces. And then I've got here, unexpected holiday today, the 9th of March. The chief rabbi's mother died. Then, a week later, another holiday, Iraq leaves the Baghdad Pact. And then the next day, monthly check from the school, 271 dinars. I must say, I lived quite well on the 271 dinars a month. And then, this is one of my busy days. 8 lessons at school in the morning. Lunch at Awiya Club. The Aware Club, as you know, was the club for expats, mostly Americans, French and English, and we spent most afternoons in their swimming pool. And after the revolution, unfortunately, the committee was taken over by Iraqis, and a lot of the activities were curtailed, and probably quite rightly, because we were a privileged few, and Qasim's ostensible reason for the revolution was to extend these privileges to the many. So we can't really complain about the Aware Club losing its individuality. 8 lessons at school today, lunch at the Aware Club, rehearsal for the Tigers players, who's a club I joined. We were an amateur dramatic club. We were presenting Arsenic and Old Lace. Then private lessons to Suad and Abdallah from 4 to 6. Then squash from 6 till 8. Then poker till midnight, lost 15 dinars. And that was a lot. That was not something I told my wife about. Now, I have mentioned the revolution to you. And one of the most exciting things that happened, a terrible thing for some people, and eventually for you yourselves, because life became very difficult for you after the revolution, as it became a little more difficult for us. But I have mentioned the revolution. It was a pivotal event in the dramatic history of Iraq. Eisenhower, at the time, Eisenhower called it the most serious international incident since the Korean War. And of course, it led eventually to the establishment of the Ba'ath Party. 5 years later, when Qasim himself was executed and his old pal Arif took over. And then eventually to Saddam Hussein and to where we are today. So that revolution 52 years ago had an important change. It made an important change in the whole history of the Middle East. Now, I myself had a very personal experience of the revolution. 2 experiences that I'll tell you about now. First, on that day, it was Monday morning, and 6 o'clock in the morning we had firing from the city. So I got up, turned on the BBC News to see if they knew what was happening, but nothing was reported on the BBC News. It was too recent. So I decided to go in and investigate for myself, much to my wife's anger, who didn't want me to leave the house. But I did, because I had a sense of adventure that I wanted to satisfy. I picked up next door, in the next bungalow, the wife of the professor of anatomy at the university. She was called Lois Startup. He was Professor Startup. Now, Lois was young and blonde, and I had a white right-hand drive Volvo with a big GB sticker. Can you imagine anything less discreet when you're trying to hide your identity? So I drove into Rashid Street with this Volvo, with this blonde sitting beside me, driving on the right-hand side. And there were mobs everywhere, screaming, shouting mobs, soldiers with guns. There were some shops being looted. And at one point, I said to Lois, I think we'll get out of here. But before we could, a crowd had seen the car, realized that we were British, and with the anti-imperialistic feelings of the time, they attacked the car. They came round the car, shook it, banged on the windscreen. And I'd been told by a friend who had been involved in various other things of that kind, keep your windows up, get into first gear, and drive slowly and don't stop, which I did. And we eventually got away and back home. And I had to face the anger of my wife Alexandra when I got home, just as Lois had to face the anger of her husband, Professor Startup. I turned on the news at lunchtime and got the BBC News and learned what had happened. That a detachment of soldiers on their way to Jordan to help the king's cousin Hussein against Israel had decided not to go to Jordan, had come into Baghdad, attacked the palace, and they killed Faisal himself, the young 23-year-old. They killed his uncle, Abdullah, who had ruled Iraq until the king had been 18. They killed Abdullah's wife, Princess Hayam, Abdullah's mother, and the king's aunt, as well as some palace guards and servants. No one knows exactly how many were killed. But by Middle Eastern standards, it was a fairly bloodless revolution, not more than a dozen. As you know, later on, it was much different in Mosul and Kirkuk, where there were lots of dead then. But at that day, on that day, Faisal himself actually had given orders not to resist. And that's why there were not quite so many deaths. The next morning, I decided, in spite of my experience of the day before, the next morning I decided to go in on foot to the city again to see what was happening. And this time I was accompanied by an Arab companion, the son of our gardener, who had come to tell me that his father would not be cutting our grass anymore. And we went into the city together, keeping a very low profile. And there was nothing but shouts of Nasser, Nasser, Nasser everywhere. The great exponent of Arab nationalism, who was the hero of the time. And we walked down Rashid Street as far as the Ministry of Defense. And there I saw the most appalling sight I have ever seen. Something which made me sick and which gave me horrible dreams for weeks after. This was the naked body of Abdullah hanging from a gallows. He had been horribly mutilated and castrated. And the crowd were throwing stones and screaming at him. You could hardly recognize this as a human body. So I turned away, and my Arabic friend said, they're beginning to be a little more sharp and anti-British, so we'd better go. So we left very quietly and went home. And I stayed at home. The next day I heard that the most hated man in Baghdad was not the king, was Nuri as-Said, the prime minister, 70 years old. And he had escaped the first day, but the second day he was caught, dressed as a woman, trying to escape, but the silly man had forgotten to take off his size 11 boots. And he was recognized as a man right away. He was shot and buried, but his body was dug up almost immediately by the mob, taken down in classic style down Rashid Street, and again mutilated so badly that someone the next day who had been there told me that it looked like a pile of basturma. So, after the revolution, the school was not closed for very long. It reopened quite quickly, although there was a curfew every afternoon. And life, although it returned to near normal, was not the same as it had been. Especially we had two young babies now, my daughter and my son. There were sudden shortages of food in Spinneys, and we couldn't get what we needed. Because I had a right-hand drive car, we were stopped frequently by the PRF and examined and told to show our credentials. And although I was sorry to leave the Frank Iny, I realized that with my young family, we couldn't stay on for very much longer. And so we left reluctantly in June 1959. And that's the story of my life at Frank Iny. It was two of the most exciting, dramatic, and interesting years of my life. And I must say, and I'm not flattering you, I was taken so much by the attitude of students at the Frank Iny. I have never taught students who were so keen and interested in learning for its own sake. So, thank you very much for listening to me. Shukran jazilan. Toda Rabba.